All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miles Glancy. I'm the General Manager of Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra and Chorale. I'd like to welcome all of our 2020 virtual members to the second installment of our musical exploration series, Pau Brazil, the heart of the tree that powers the bow. Thank you so much for continuing to support our organization and the content we produce, especially at a time when we can't connect with you in the concert halls. Now, before we begin, I'd like to give everyone a quick crash course on Zoom webinar. First of all, your video camera and your microphone are disabled throughout this event, so we're unable to see you or hear you. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find a Q&A tab. If you click on this tab, you are able to type and submit a question to our panelists. There's also a send anonymous option if you'd prefer that. These questions will be reviewed throughout the event, and at the end, we'll try and get through any questions you might have for our panelists. If you need assistance at any time, you can use the chat feature, also at the bottom of your screen, or you can email info@philharmonia.org. I must remind you all that with any live streamed event, we may experience some connectivity issues and sound or video blips, and we apologize in advance if that does happen, and we thank you for your patience. Now it's my honor to introduce the panelists for this afternoon. Professor Emeritus of Plant Cell Biology at UC Berkeley, Zac Cande, joined by PBO violinist and Director of Education, Lisa Grodin, and PBO cellist, Paul Hale. Enjoy.
Well, it's a delight to be here and to do this panel. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I can. Good. You know, I've been auditing as a retired professor. I've been auditing several Zoom courses, and I found it very disconcerting when compared to actually lecturing with real students, which I did for 40 years at Cal. In any case, I want to welcome you all here, and I want to thank Lisa and Paul for helping me talk about bows. And I'm an amateur cellist, and I got interested in this subject because I'm also a plant biologist. And I was interested in the wood that went into bows and their special properties. And what I want to get across to you today is that bows are made of the modern bow in particular, but almost all bows are made of a special wood called Pau Brazil. The bow makers call it pernambuco, and it's an endangered species. And the fact that it's endangered is going to affect everything for musicians in the future. Now let me just get to my screen, and I want to share my desktop with you. Hopefully this is going to work. Okay, can everybody see this? Is this visible? Okay, so what I want to say is the bow is the violinist, what the paintbrush is the artist. It creates the individuality of each artist's particular sound. And this is a quote from Oliveira, a famous violinist. The function of the bow is to vibrate the string. And if you think about it for a second, the bow can make a particular bow can make a instrument sound brighter because it's suppressing lower overtones and giving you higher overtones, or it can make it sound darker because you're selecting for lower overtones. So that's one thing a bow can do. The second thing a bow does is it gives you different mechanical properties depending on the bow, which permit different bow strokes. And we're going to explore both of these functions of the bow today. But the important thing is these functions are a property of the wood used to make the bows. Baroque bows were made out of a variety of wood, but the modern violin bow, what I mean by modern is the bow that was designed by Tort and was used from about 1820 on to play symphonic music, is made of a special wood called pernambuco by the bow makers. It's called by the rest of the world Pau Brazil. And it's the wood that Brazil, the country, is named after. It comes from Brazil, and it's an endangered species, which is found only in Brazil. And the worry is that there will not be any pernambuco in the future. So this talk is going to have two parts. First, we're going to talk about bows in general and why the wood is so important. And I'm going to describe the modern bow. And we're going to have demonstrations from Paul showing off the difference between a Baroque and a modern bow. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tort, who designed the modern bow and really focused on pernambuco. And Lisa will give a talk, a demonstration about different bow strokes that you can get with a bow. Now, there was a revolution in music performance venues in the 18th century. You went from the early part of the 18th century, you were in small halls and dance halls at court. to court ballrooms for concerts. And by the end of the 18th century, you were in large concert halls with subscription audiences instead of having small halls with noble patrons. Paris at the end of the 18th century was a hotbed of virtuosity. You were a great violinist, you went to Paris because that was where the money was, because that's where the nobility, I mean, even Mozart went to Paris, right? But that's where the money is. And you had, at the time of the French revolutions, the classical musicians were very much identified with the nobility, but at the end of the revolution, and into the 18th century, 19th century, you had revolutionary orchestras playing in large halls by subscription. So in Paris, Baroque violins were retrofitted for more power as large halls were more important. And at the same time, the modern bow was invented. And the modern bow, the modern style bow, which we'll go into in a minute, had more power and a different articulation of bow strokes than in previous style bows. It could do different things than a Baroque bow. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's just different. And that's an important distinction to make. Now, Tort, a bow maker who lived in Paris for about, I'll give you the exact dates, but he was around at the time of the French Revolution, was the father of the modern bow. The Tort style bow is what's used in every symphony orchestra today, with the exception of the Philharmonic Baroque. But San Francisco Symphony, they're all playing in Tort style bows. When Annie Sopha-Mutter gets up to play a Brahms, a Sibelius violin concerto, if she plays Paganini, she's not a Tort style bow. These bows were adopted for power, and what I mean by power is loud volume, and they were adopted for smooth bow strokes and very bouncy articulated bow strokes, not necessarily the type of things you could do on a Baroque bow. The adaptations were several-fold. Now, in these images, the top is a Tort bow, and I've just named the parts here. You can see, and down below is a comparison of a Tort style bow with a Baroque bow. And you can see several really striking differences. The first is that the Tort bow, the Tort style bow, is convex. It's bent and it's in towards the string. Whereas and in contrast, the Baroque bow is straight and it only curves down in a concave fashion towards the string, towards the hair of the bow at the very end. So that's one big difference. This concave versus the convex. The second thing is the head of the Tort bow is massive compared to the delicate tip of the Baroque bow. And the hair is far away. If you go to the frog, the other end of the bow, you can see the hair, the frog, if anything, is further away in the Baroque bow from the stick than it is in the Tort bow. It's much more uniform. So both at either end, the bows are different. The second big difference is that in the frog of the Tort bow is movable. You turn the screw and the frog will move towards the end of the bow. That puts tension on the hair and the bow straightens out, keeping the tension. Whereas the frog of the Baroque bow is a clip, and you can't really change or adjust the tension. You can't really increase it beyond it. Once it's clipped in, that's it. The other differences is the taper and the taper of the bow. If you look at this, the Baroque bow is very straight, and then it has a bend at the tip, whereas you have, of course, this camber where it's bent all along its length. And if you look at the Tort bow, you can see it's thinnest right around the head, and it gets gradually thicker. Actually, it's a very logarithmic projection. Mathematicians have developed models to explain what Tort did, probably by intuition, but you can see it gradually gets thicker and thicker, and it's thickest right at the frog where you would grab the bow. So these are the adaptations. The camber of the wood, which is giving you that inverse curve, which can be straightened out. The taper, which is different than the Baroque bow, and a massive head, which can wiggle at the tip to give you more bounce at the tip than you would ever get with a Baroque bow. And the important thing is, all of these innovations were designed with pernambuco in mind. Baroque bows were made out of a variety of woods. Pernambuco was not the favored wood. It was thought to be too lively. They used, it said, snakewood, which we'll get to see in a minute, or blackwood, both of which were stiffer and heavier than Pernambuco. So Tort designed this model bow to be used with Pernambuco. Now, this is a series of transition bows. You could see a Baroque bow, like I just described, and these other bows are transitional bows. So the Baroque bow would be used around 1700 or 1720, the music of Vivaldi. The bow at the bottom, Tort bow, might be used to play Tchaikovsky. It might be used to play Berlioz, things like that in the 1820s and 1830s. And in between are transition bows, which were used in the period in between, as there was an evolution of bows. And you can see some features, for example, at the tip in these later stage bows. And you can also see that they have movable frogs. But eventually all of these features and more were incorporated by Tort to make the Tort model. And once the Tort model was developed, and it swept throughout Europe, and these other bows were after about 1830 weren't really used anymore. Okay, the last thing before Paul plays is I just want to show off the frog a little bit more in the wood. So here in the left is a modern frog. It's the frog that was designed by Tort, and it has a metal ring to help spread out the hair. So you use a lot more hair in a modern bow, and it's spread out very thin. And it can move on this screw. And in contrast, if you look at the frog for the Baroque bow, it's a clip-on frog. You can't change the tension. The second thing to point out is the wood. The wood in the modern bow is Pernambuco, Pau Brazil to the Brazilians and the rest of the world, but Pernambuco to the bow makers. It's a reddish wood. It's very dense. It's not as dense, however, as snakewood and ironwood. And ironwood is many different species, all tropical. Snakewood is one tropical species found both in Brazil and in the Caribbean. All these woods are denser than water. They're very strong. But Pernambuco is more flexible and lively, bends more. It's the springiest it's one of the springiest woods ever found. Both snakewood and ironwood and the other woods used in Baroque bows are much stiffer. So if you were making a Baroque bow, you would like to have you prefer snakewood over Pernambuco. And in transition bows, you find a variety of woods being used as they tried out different things. In a modern bow, you don't, except for right at the very beginning when they made a few bows out of ironwood and things like that, you don't make them out of Pernambuco. They're considered inferior. So now Paul is going to demonstrate with two different cello bows how different woods and different models affect sound production. And he's going to play a saraband from a Bach G major suite. And he's going to use a blackwood bow, a Baroque bow made with blackwood by Charles English, who's a contemporary maker, and a modern Pernambuco bow. That's a Tort style bow made by John Greenwood, who's a local maker. So let me get off of the screen share and let these guys take over. I got to get out of this stop share, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Hello, everybody. Here is a Baroque bow I'll show you, made of blackwood. And Zac had a nice picture of it there. And here's the here's the modern bow I'll show you. This is made of Pernambuco, of course. There's the big tip. Now, if I may generalize, I could generalize about the differences between these two bows. Every generalization has lots of exceptions, of course, but I could say that many Baroque bows tend to encourage the player to round off notes, especially toward the tip. And partly because so many Baroque bows tend to encourage the player the bow tends to want to come out of the string beautifully. So it's kind of more like speaking. And the modern bow, Pernambuco, with its strong concave shape, tends to encourage the player to sustain notes more, and the bows tend to want to stay on the string more. Of course, any player can do whatever they want, but it's especially fun with a Baroque bow to see how its characteristics may enlighten you into the Baroque music that you're playing. Now for this modern bow.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, but I just want to point out to people one wonderful thing as a cellist. It's so obvious to me, which is, first of all, what he's doing is he holds the two bows differently. And you might just gesture for a second. The grip of the hand is different on the two bows. And secondly, the bow distribution of notes is different. That is to say, where you play the notes in the two bows. And you mentioned that, but it's really different. And it's just so, to me, watching it, so striking. I just didn't really appreciate it. Oh, wow. I really am grateful for that demonstration. Okay, let me get back to my PowerPoint, if I can do it. Okay, this was, and you can see the difference in the two bows. The massive tip, I mean, the thing is, with the torque bow, you have this massive tip, and it's thinnest right behind the tip, and it can wiggle a little bit, and that gives an extra bounce, and allows you to do the things at the tip that you couldn't do on a Baroque bow. And that's an important difference. Now, you lose stuff too. The tonal qualities of the torque bow playing the same piece of music and the pernambuco and the Baroque bow will be different. But that's the price you pay. Now, the inventor of the modern bow was Francis Xavier Tourt, the Younger. And you could call him many things. He's a Stradivarius of the bow. He lived from 1745 through the French Revolution to 1835. And he really is the father of the modern bow. That Tourt-style bow, he put everything together. We'll see in the transition there are a lot of features, but he standardized the length of the bow. He standardized the taper that's along the bow. He used the massive head that he used, and the fact that it's thinnest behind there. These are all things that some of these are in transition bows and other bows, but he really standardized all of that. And finally, he invented the modern frog with the ferrule, spread the hair out. And he standardized the length and the balance point. So we all this the Tourt. And he did this in collaboration with the foremost violinist of his age. The sort of the superpower was Viotti, who was at the court, the French court, and they worked together. Viotti wanted powerful violins. He didn't care what they did to them. He just wanted them to be louder. He wanted a powerful bow, and he pushed Tourt to make that powerful bow. When the French Revolution came, Viotti had been so identified with the nobility, he fled Paris, 1789 or 1790, and went to England. And he took with him Tourt bows, obviously, and the English makers started to make bows in that style. And similarly, other musicians who have been in Paris and in orchestras, several of them fled, and they took this style of bow to other places as well. But in any case, the first Tourt bow that we know about is from 1786. Now, Tourt, we have over 1,000 bows left from the Tourt era. And people still, some of them are in museums, but many of them are still played. They're valuable, just as you would play Strads. This is a price, an auction, a bow went into auction about 10 years ago for $182,000. And since then, a very famous torte bow, which was a presentation bow for a Russian prince, which was decorated in jewels, went for $325,000. So torte bows are still used. They're admired objects, but they're playable. They're considered a little lively compared to some of the modern bows, which are a little bit, they're even more powerful and a little bit stiffer. But torte bows are something that's desired by, if you're a modern soloist, you might feel lucky to play on a retrofitted Strad, and you might feel lucky to play with a torte bow. Or you might have a whole bunch of bows, because each bow brings its own thing to an instrument. And a torte bow might be good for some things, but might not be good for others, and you'd want a modern bow. But in any case, torte bows are still used today because the torte style bow is the popular bow. Modern bow makers fool around with the head. They fool around with a little bit about how thin it is in here. They fool around with the head. They fool around a tiny bit with the frog. But basically, if you had, there's not much difference. Now, in the mid-1700s, torte began experimenting with pernambuco because it was more responsive than the other woods used to make bows. It was more responsive, it's livelier than snakewood or these other tropical woods. And what they use is the heart, the red heart of the wood, not outer sapwood, which isn't as strong. And the thing to remember is that good pernambuco is heavier than water. Some logs are lighter, that's crappy pernambuco. And that was often sold and used in bows and called Brazil wood. So at that time, and even now, you hear, oh, it's made out of Brazil wood, it's a cheap bow. Sometimes that's pernambuco, sometimes that's other wood. But good pernambuco is dense wood, heavier than water, very lively. And that's the importance of it for modern bows. Now the bows are carved. They are not, the wood is quite toxic, so one occupational hazard of working with bows is not to get allergic to the wood, bow wood. And here is Charles Espy, a famous bowmaker, planing the bow, and you can see here the tight grain. All of the bows that torte made after about 1800 were all made in pernambuco. Before then, he made bows out of a variety of materials, transitional bows. But once he found this model, he did not deviate, and pernambuco was the key. The bow is, after you carve it, the bow is then bent, and it's bent over an alcohol lamp. And other makers did this, but the camber, the degree of bending on the torte model was the standard thing. And there are subtle changes that bow makers have done to that, but it's basically in response to torte. Now, Lisa Grodin is going to demonstrate the different bow strokes on several classical violin bows. And from left to right, we're going to have she's going to show you a copy of a Dodd bow, a Coltman copy of a Dodd transitional bow. And she's going to also show a Metal transitional style bow. And next to it, just for comparison, is the torte style bow, which is slightly longer and has a very different frog. So she's going to show how these different types of bows, which are all made out of pernambuco, although they may be slightly different grades, how they sound. So let me turn this part over to Lisa. I have to get out of the share and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm just so happy to be part of this program. Really have missed PBO audiences, and this is a great way to connect. And Paul, it's great to hear you play. Thank you so much, Zach, for this wonderful lecture, and Miles for your technical support. So I'm going to play actually two transitional bows. They are both made out of pernambuco. So even though they're made out of the same type of wood, they sound and handle quite differently. I'm first going to play this coulter bow, and it's very delicate at the tip. At the frog, there's no decoration that might weigh it down, whereas my other bow that I'm going to demonstrate has a relatively heavy tip, and there is some winding at the frog, which adds some weight to it. The bows are simply cambered a little bit differently also. So to show you how they respond so differently, I wrote a couple of little pieces, variations really on the same sort of piece, to show you the different bow strokes. I think that's a better way than talking ad nauseum about the different bow strokes. So here we go. And this is the coulter bow. the light, buoyant sounding one. So that bow likes to be off the string a lot. And in comparison is the Voltermetal bow. Heavier, deeper, richer.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you so much. Okay, are we back full screen here with this? Let's see. Okay, so this is, I mean, one thing that's wonderful in hearing these different bows is that you realize violinists, they have and cellists, they have a bunch of bows. They aren't satisfied with one bow. There is no such thing as the perfect all-star bow. Some bows are better for one thing, some bows are better for another. My wife who was formerly a professional violist and a violinist, has a bunch of bows, and suddenly she gets tired of one. She wants to try a different bow because it enriches her life and it makes her more excited. And I'm sure you guys are the same way. You both have a bunch of bows. They make a big difference. What is the difference? Part of it is the different models, but part of it, and a very important part, is the wood. A great bow, regardless of the style of the model, will have great wood in it that's responsive in the right sorts of ways for the things you want to do. And the thing about pernambuco is it's a very lively wood, much livelier than what a Baroque bow user would like. They would like to have snakewood, which is heavier. So the problem is, what's going to happen in the future? Oops. Okay, I'm having a little trouble here. So pernambuco, the wood, was discovered when the Portuguese discovered Brazil. Cabral discovered Brazil, landed in the northeast coast on the state of Pernambuco about 1500. The fleet was originally going to go around Africa to India, but instead it came over here, inspired by Christopher Columbus. The Portuguese were very disappointed because they didn't find spices. This wasn't India. They didn't find gems. They didn't find gold. But what they did find was Pernambuco. If you see here, here's some Tupi Indians in this painting. And the Tupi were the tribe that were all along the coast, these endogenous peoples. And they had very large bows and arrows. The bows themselves were 5 as tall as a person. And they were made out of Pernambuco. It was very flexible. It was the ideal material for bows and archery use. And their clothing was dyed to a certain extent red using this wood. And the Portuguese immediately recognized the importance of this because they knew about the dye. The dye is called Brazilian, and it was originally found in the sapan wood, which is a relative of Pernambuco, Pau Brazil, which is found in Southeast Asia in places like Thailand. It's more of a shrub than a tree, and you grind it up and you can get a red dye, the same red dye as Pernambuco, but Pernambuco is a much better source. So the Portuguese were primed because of their trade with India to look for this dye, and they really recognized it's important. So Pau Brazil was the first major export for 50 or 60 years. 80% of the wealth that was shipped to Europe from Brazil was in the form of Pau Brazil. Exceedingly important, so important, they named the country after the wood. Pau means wood, Brazil means ember, as in red ember. And they named the country Brazil because of this. There were wars fought, and the Dutch tried to seize settlements in northern Brazil, and they fought wars in the early 1500s, and it was to try to get access to this wood. So exporting this wood was a monopoly of the Portuguese crown, and it was exceedingly important, very valuable. Now, the Tupi Indians were forced to help the Portuguese harvest this wood, but it was always a rare thing. And eventually, other agricultural practices were put in place. The next big thing about 1580s, 1570s was sugarcane. So sugarcane, which originally was planted in Brazil, and there were big sugar plantations, and sugar was exported. By 1600, that was a major export. The Tupi Indians refused to be involved in that. They ran off, and instead a massive slave trade with Central Africa was initiated, and the plantations were all run in slave labor. And the entire sociology of Brazil is incredibly shaped by those events. After sugarcane, other crops became important, like coffee and cotton. In any case, for the first 50 years or 60 years of Brazil's life, Pau Brazil is the thing. And this is just to illustrate a few more facts. The dye is Brazilian. You grind up the pernambuco wood and you extract it. And it's a very toxic business. It was done basically with orphans, with prisoners of war, and prisoners would do it because the dust was very toxic. The logs were imported to Europe. And even though it was a Portuguese monopoly, there were thousands of tons of wood were available in France and other countries for dye production. They would dye wool. Here's the color of schemes of wool dyed with pernambuco. And it was a sign of wealth to have red clothing in general. And these robes here were probably in a painting by Titian, a Venetian noble, a wealthy Venetian family, are probably pernambuco. Eventually, other dyes also became important. There was a dye for cochineal beetle, and in the 1850s or so, all these natural red dyes were replaced by synthetic dyes, aniline dyes from the German chemical industry. Now, the problem with pernambuco was it was easy to extract, easy to dye, but it was not very light fast. It would fade in light. But it was still exceedingly important. Tons of wood were imported to France. So Tort would have access to this wood because of the need for making dye in Lyon. And using it in Lyon to dye the wool. Now, pernambuco is a member of the pea family. And the name of the plant has been changed to Pau Brasilia. It used to be called Caesalpinia, but it's Pau Brasilia echinata. It's in a genus. It's a very primitive pea. If you look at the flowers and you know what pea flowers look like, which I can barely remember, this is a very symmetrical flower compared to the pea flower. The peas, beans, they're all in the legume family. We think of legumes that also involve in nitrogen fixation. It's not clear where the Pau Brasilia is, but the thing that's really fascinating, I find fascinating about this, is that the pea family in general is the most abundant tropical family of trees. There are more tropical trees of different species in the pea family than any other family in Central and South America and in Africa. And many of the woods that are used to make musical instruments were brought in as furniture or as dye stuffs or whatever to Europe, and then they were adopted for musical instruments. So Brazilian rosewood is one example, used in guitars and lutes, and now snakewood is another, and we'll talk about snakewood bows. Another one is African black snake oboes. It's a very oily wood from Africa, and it's in the legume family as well. And things like hematoxylin, which has a very purple wood and used in dyes, they were also used in bow making. So these imperial conquerors, these empire spreaders, they brought back wood, and the instrument makers and the bow makers benefited. So here down here is the equivalent of a pea pod. It's several inches long, maybe 3 or 4, heavily armored, and with about 5 or 6 huge peas in it. This is a Pau Brazil tree. They're grown in addition to be found in the forest, they're also, because it's a national tree, it's found in parks and so on and so forth. I'm not sure whether this is a park. This looks like a park. But the trees have a sort of an umbrella-shaped crown. They're very tall. They can be as high as 100 feet. And if you expose the heartwood, you can see how red it is. And as it oxidizes, it gets darker. And the thing is interesting, and I was just talking about this with Lisa, was talking about it, is that bow makers liked the darker wood because they thought that showed the wood was older. The bow is old if the wood is dark and not bright red. And so they used to fume the wood stalks in a little bit of nitrous oxide to make the wood get oxidized and appear darker, totally artificially. So you see you'll see different shades of pernambuco as well, and that reflects in part the various secondary compounds that are in it. But bright red is pernambuco, that's the dye Brazilian. Now, the Pau Brazil is a signature tree of the Atlantic rainforest, which is a biodiversity hotspot. It's one of the 35 major hotspots. This is not the Amazon rainforest. This is another rainforest that stretches along the coast of Brazil from Pernambuco at the very northeast edge all the way down to Argentina. It's along the coast. It's much more temperate. It's not tropical. It's somewhat variable, this forest. There's swampy areas, which are all like mangrove swamp, and there are other areas which are much drier. And Pernambuco, within this Atlantic rainforest, like the somewhat drier areas. And this is a picture here of a golden lion tamarin, which is a very unusual monkey found in the rainforest. And to show you how bad things are, there's only a few thousand of them left. And then this is an image here of a preserved, a natural, it's down near Rio de Janeiro, where there are several national parks to preserve the Atlantic rainforest. Now, the sad fact is that this is a habitat in crisis. There's only about 7% of it left. The green here on this map, or the yellow outline, like 500 years ago when the Portuguese first discovered Brazil. Up here you can see this is the Atlantic, this is the Amazon, and the Amazon rainforest. So this is down along the coast. It's wet, but it's also a little drier certainly than the Amazon, not as humid. It's more like in some ways, it's more like in terms of climate, it's more like the rainforest in the Olympic Peninsula up in Washington. But you can see there's very little land left, only 7%, very little indeed. So this is a real problem for the bow makers, which we'll get into in a minute. Why is there so little left? Well, the Atlantic rainforest, in terms of climate, is the nicest part of Brazil. 70% of the population of Brazil lives in the Atlantic rainforest. It is also along the coast, which was settled first. So this is a picture of Sao Paulo, which is a city of now, I think it's at least 12 or 13 million. It's one of the largest cities in the world. And it encroaches on, it's all the area that was once the Atlantic rainforest. The same is true for all the major cities along the coast. All the population is living on land that was formerly the Atlantic rainforest. And the second thing to comment on is that what the Portuguese did and what the Indians before them did, the way they treated this rainforest is a slash and burn. They would burn the rainforest off and then plant crops. Now the Tupi did not repeatedly burn it. They didn't clear out the stumps. They burned it, they planted a few things, gourds or whatever, and then they moved on. They didn't occupy any one site for very long. Whereas the Portuguese burned and burned, and they cleared out the stumps because they were going to convert it into something else. And that forest, handled in that way, does not regenerate very well. Whereas the Tupi, with their milder methods of dealing with clearance, those forests could be regenerated. So a lot of this forest is probably irreversibly lost. I've read accounts now where they're trying to regenerate the forest, but it's not easy. So slash and burn. You slashed and burned, you cleared it off, and then you could plant sugarcane, You could plant, later on it was coffee and cotton. Now it's also pulp, timber, so on and so forth. And you did some illegal lumbering. There were attempts early on to preserve the ecology of the forest. The Portuguese emperor back in the 1700s, the 1650s, some of the first ecological laws published about ecology and preserving habitats were with respect to this forest, did no good. And this is what it looks like after repeated slashing and burning and then using it for some other purpose. There's basically none of the original forest is left. A few trees here and there. This land will not easily regenerate. And this land would be used, for example, cotton, here sugar cane rather. Here are fragments of a forest surrounded by sugar cane plantations. And these fragments, unfortunately, are so small that they're not very ecologically viable. And there are conservation groups now trying to buy up in certain areas a bunch of fragments and trying to connect them again. You can't imagine a monkey troop, for example, surviving in one small fragment. They would need more land to travel on. Just think of it that way. But in any case, these are some fragments of forest surrounded by sugar cane plantations. In the state of Pernambuco, a lot of it is cattle. You can see how dry, scrubby it looks. These areas, many of them are very poor now. Cattle and other agricultural uses. Well, back in June of 2007, Pau Brazil was included on the Appendix 2 of the CITES Treaty. So CITES is a convention on international trade in endangered species. And you may know about this if you've ever thought about, if you ever had to deal with made out of ivory. So Appendix 1 are species threatened with extinction. Absolutely no trading involved. And elephant ivory and Brazilian rosewood are two examples. You're not allowed to bring ivory into the country. Even bows with a lot of ivory in them for a while, until they just recently made some special exceptions. They weren't going to allow that to cross borders. Brazilian rosewood, if you have a guitar made with Brazilian rosewood, you're not allowed to transport it from one country to another. Gibson guitar had stocks of Brazilian rosewood, which was seized, and they were fined $350,000 for owning it. So the bow makers were very worried that Pernambuco would be put on Appendix 1. And said if that had happened, that would be the end of the bow trade. You wouldn't be able to get wood, you wouldn't be able to carry bows across borders, so on and so forth. But they did a lot of lobbying, and it was put on, and for various reasons, not just the bow makers' concerns, but the Brazilian government, it was put in Appendix 2, where the trade must be controlled and tightly regulated, but it's not forbidden completely. And there are many plants and animals that are in this category, and Pau Brazil is one of them. So what do you have going on today? First of all, you have bow wood that's recycled, Pernambuco that's recycled from stem posts and other logs, from buildings and stuff. And recycled wood can be sold. I'm not showing you any examples of that. But there is a company called Arcos Brazil, which has plantations, it has nurseries, and it has and it supports nature reserve, and it's allowed to export bow blanks. And you can see pictures there. And it also has a bunch of bow makers, and you can get a bow made by a bow maker from Arcos Brazil. They're Brazilian bows made out of Pernambuco. And this is an important source of wood. The second thing that happened is that in 1997, even before it was put on Appendix 2, the bow makers of the world realized that this was a real problem. If there's no Pernambuco, or if it's highly regulated, there are no more, you couldn't make a bow. So they established the IPCI, it's the International Pernambuco Conservation Initiative. And they raised, it's probably much more than 3.7 million, that was a few years ago. They raised money, and that money was used to regulate inventory wood stocks. That is to say, how much wood the various bow makers around the world have. Because usually a bow maker gets some wood and he sits on it for the rest of his life. They are also involved in lobbying to regulate the importation, and they helped to lobby to make sure it was on Appendix 2 and not Appendix 1. Other money is used for plantations, and it's used also to help buy nature reserves, which is various other groups are also involved with. And finally, they are involved in music education in Brazil. They support various educational programs for children. And the idea there is that if there is a natural lobby of classical musicians in Brazil playing violins and using pernambuco bows, this will be a very strong force for preserving pernambuco. So let me just finally describe the future. The future, first of all, for the bow maker will be grim unless the plantation works well. And it looks like plantation wood will work. The wood has to grow for about 30 years or so before they can harvest it. And they're starting to harvest it now. The worry was that if the trees grow fast in a plantation, it won't be the same as the tree that grows slowly in a forest. Another thing that they're doing, the bow makers are doing, is looking for substitute woods. Ipi, haka, greenheart. These are, so far, they've been making bows out of these woods. There's two problems. The first is that they're all tropical woods as well, and they're also rare, in some cases endangered, and they aren't, and they don't, and none of them are as good as pernambuco. Here's a picture of Ralph Ashby, bow maker. I think Lisa has one of his bows. He's cutting up a mountain mahogany, and it turns out the wood is very dense, but it's a little too brittle to make a bow, but it's good for frogs. And a third thing that's happening is that there's now a big movement to make bows out of artificial materials, carbon fiber. And there's been a lot of work with carbon fiber to make the bows that are more usable. The carbon fiber bows today are different than the carbon fiber bows of 5 or 10 years ago. But the one thing you could say is a carbon fiber and a pernambuco bow, they're different. Some people might like one better than the other, but they're certainly not the same and not comparable. I know the Alexander String Quartet, when I go in concert, they play all in carbon fiber bows. They worked out how to make great music with them, and they love them. But it's not for everyone. The final thing I'd like to do now is just make some acknowledgments. I want to acknowledge Charles Espy, the bow maker, who gave me a bunch of the photographs of Brazil, and I talked to about it. And he was one of the founders of the IPCI. And I want to put up the IPCI website if you want to look into that further. And they'd always love to have a donation. And this other thing I want to do is acknowledge the Waverly Foundation. They gave funds to the PSO to purchase snakewood bows. And if you look across here, you can see they're not just violin bows, but they're also must be cello and they may be a bass bow there. They're all made out of snakewood. They're all modern bows in the sense that they were made recently. They're not modern bows in the sense of style. They're all Baroque bows. They're to be used for the orchestra's educational program. So I want to thank you, and Miles, I want to open this up for questions.
I am here, ready to go. We have 3 questions. Zach, if you want to stop sharing your screen, and then I'll pop myself in. Let me switch the gallery view here so we can all see everyone. I hope everyone can, actually, why don't I unpin you? Okay, I think everyone can see all 4 of us now. Zach, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. I have to say, it's always, to me, the simplest of tools that have the most complex histories. So thank you for talking through the history of the bow. It's such a, it's adding another powerful perspective to how we're treating our world and our precious lands. So thank you very much for that. And thanks so much to Lisa and Paul for giving such beautiful demonstrations of the bows that you have. We have 3 questions, one of which, and any of you can answer this, is the Pernambuco die ever used in instrument varnish?
The answer is no.
No, okay.
Okay, the dyes that the instrument varnish, they would use a little bit, if they wanted it redder like the Venetians, I believe they used madder and other things. The problem with Pernambuco, for one thing, Pernambuco was very expensive, and it's water soluble, not oil soluble, it fades in the light. it would not be suitable for an instrument varnish, which would have to be an organic, it would have to be something that's soluble in oil. But it's just, no, it's just not light, it's too light sensitive to be used for that purpose.
Fair enough. Some modern bows are hexagonal. Was that ever the case with Baroque bows? And when did that tradition start?
I can't answer for Baroque bows, but the thing, you might say, why round versus hexagonal in the first place for modern bows? And that's probably, a bow maker is given a piece of wood, or he has access to wood. Some of it is denser than other woods, pernambuco. It varies all over the map. Tort probably went through hundreds of logs. He had the beautiful benefit of being able to do that. Later makers didn't have access to enough wood. Tort made a few hexagonal bows, but he mostly made the round sticks. There's more wood for the weight. There's more wood in a hexagonal bow, and it's often used in bows where the wood is not quite, is called, quote, weaker. So the properties of what that means is that the properties of a hexagonal bow, weaker is not bad. In fact, weaker means more lively in some ways.
Right.
A hexagonal bow has different mechanical properties than a round bow. You would make a hexagonal bow because the wood demanded that you do it that way. And also, because hexagonal bows are actually harder to make in terms of craftsmanship.
I'm sure.
But it's partially a property of the wood and what the maker likes and how he wants to treat the wood, whether he would stick to hexagonal or round. And most French bows, especially of the Tort era, are round, not hexagonal, but there are some.
Thank you. That makes a whole lot of sense. If Baroque bows are a better match for playing Baroque music, do modern instrument players ever use them instead of a Tort bow? Anyone want to respond to that?
Sure, I'll respond to that. It's increasingly common for players who play modern instruments to really be required to have a background in period performance practice. And there is a fairly lively business around the purchase of Baroque bows for them to play with. And also Baroque violins, violas, cellos as well. My old professor back in Oberlin, Marilyn McDonald, who is still as vibrant as ever, says that her students are just, they're told that they have to know everything. They have to know Baroque style, jazz, everything, absolutely everything. So the answer is yes.
Great. And then this question just came in. Were different bows used for viola da gamba as opposed to cello, or did they use, pretty much the same bow?
Well, yes. I think many bows were made more special for the viola da gamba, partly because, well, the bow grip was so different. A cello player holds the bow from above, and a gamba player holds it from below. And also, I think a lot of gamba players end up playing more in the upper half of the bow, which is here. Cello players, I think, end up playing more in the lower half of the bow down here. So bows can be made to work well for either instrument that way. Although I think I've owned a couple of bows that were made more especially for the gamba, but worked well in my hand for the kind of playing I wanted to do. I think back then also there was 200-300 years ago, there was just so much less standardization. So, and many cello players in the Bay Area now play both gamba and cello and might use the same bow on different instruments. So it really varies a lot, yeah.
Well, thank you for your questions. Charlie, very much enjoyed your presentation, Zach. He's fast asleep. Oh, the joys of running the show from home. Anything else, Lisa, that you want to say, or?
Just a big thank you to everyone who participated and who watched, and Zach, it was really informative. Thank you so much. And Paul,
thank you so much, Zach.
So great. Thank you. Thank you, Miles.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this event as part of our musical exploration series. As a reminder, our next member event is next Wednesday at 11 a.m. We'll be featuring a virtuosic Israeli mandolinist, Avi Avital. I'm very excited about this, in conversation with our Jews and music scholar, Francesco Spagnolo. And then next Thursday at 11 is our next Live from Amsterdam event, which will be all about Beethoven, featuring our music director, Richard Egar, and his wife, Alexandra Nepomniachtchaya, playing 4 hand arrangements of Beethoven's symphonies by Czerny. And a final reminder that you can view all upcoming events and access past content in the Members Lounge on our website. That's it for me. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all, Lisa, Zach, and Paul. And we'll see you next time. Have a good Labor Day weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you. You
Thank
too.
you.
Bye.
Bye.